Sorry about that. I accidentally was pressing live, and I'm like, "Wait, no, I'm not ready." So, yeah, I just just, like, did a quick leave. Okay. Um, I'm going to change this title, and then we can get started, and definitely get your password updated on LinkedIn as well. Um
Oh, I don't have to launch it on LinkedIn. It's okay.
No, I just mean in general, just 'cause
Oh, yeah.
yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna change the episode title to Uplifting Indigenous Communities
Okay.
in Supporting Healing Practices in Speech Pathology.
Okay. I got 2
That's all.
books here then.
Excellent.
I'll show these 2 as one for, like, burnout prevention and, like, wellness, and then one is, more stories. Really beautiful.
Okay, so we are live, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. Yes, so everyone, thank you so much for coming onto the live today. Welcome back to the Pediatric Speech Sister Show. I am so excited to have Nima Novak on here today. I reached out to her because we are approaching Indigenous Peoples Month, and there's a lot of we'll really get into it when we get into our conversation. But I know personally, I had a lot of questions about how we could be more culturally responsive to for the Indigenous communities. And then when you sent me your bio, Nima, I realized that you are taking a healing approach to the to the sciences. And so I'm very fascinated about your work there. Now, Nima, would you like to tell us your bio, or would you like for me to read your bio?
Oh, you can. That would be okay. I don't have it in front of me.
Okay. So Nima Novak is a Mohawk speech language pathologist from Iroquois Nation.
Mhm.
Beautiful. She holds a Bachelor's of Arts in Psychology and a Master's of Science in Speech Language Pathology. She's worked extensively in marginalized communities, specifically in Oxnard with Indigenous preschool population and on the west side of Chicago, where she has firsthand seen the negative effects of trauma on speech, language, and fluency development. She is currently studying somatic therapies, polyvagal theory, and mindful self compassion to promote healing across the community she serves with the intention of loving kindness for all. Her focus on evidence based practices and empirical research serves to bridge the worlds of healing and science, which are often relegated to different categories. Nima's holistic approach of resilience and education teaches how research based mindfulness practices can be used to manage trauma in the body for both her students and colleagues experiencing the effects of secondary trauma. Nima is also a community speaker, writer, teacher, and consultant dedicated to making the world a safer place. So, thank you for existing, Nima. Thank you so much,
Thank
truly.
you.
Is there anything that I missed with your bio that you'd like to add?
No, thank you. I'm just so grateful to be here with you, and I'm really excited to talk about all of this with you.
Yes, I'm thrilled. If you can tell us a little bit about your background and your why for continuing in this profession.
Oh yeah. Let's see, how deep do I want to go in my background? But speech therapy was a second career for me. And so when I came into the program, I feel like I was a lot more focused and a lot more curious about things. And I love being in the field because I feel like seeing students improve or clients gain back skills or learn new skills that help them navigate the world in a way for themselves. Like, it really is it's a gift. I feel like I'm so lucky I get to be with you while you're doing this. And the field is so interesting. It's always changing, new research coming out. And so it keeps my attention. I don't feel bored at all in speech therapy. So right now I work in the schools. I feel like in the future, though, I'll switch over to like rehab or working with adults. So once I can't do any more paperwork days. So
Right. Yeah. The paperwork days, I felt that really hard. So Let's go ahead and get into the bit on how we can create safer treatment environments for Indigenous populations. What would you say that the biggest challenges that Indigenous people face in healthcare and in education?
Yeah, so in my own personal experience, in what families have told me and what students tell me, is just not being seen and heard. Um, and so the biggest barrier, is actually like the staff I work with not being aware of their own implicit biases, or coming into settings where they're like, I'm the expert about you, I'm the expert about this topic, and dismissing maybe the student or the family's experience. And in that dismissal, you miss so much. You miss so much information that cuts down communication. Like, you don't have rapport with the family then to like get a deeper understanding of what's going on outside of the school setting. And then, like, US culture, which ignores, the violent history that Native people have had to survive. I feel like there's a shift now,
Mhm.
um, like where we're seeing more movies coming out, TV shows. Social media, is such a great way that you can. I feel like there's more awareness now because of social media, like the pressures of having to like post and stuff. But yeah, I think right now this year, for the first time, I was in an IEP meeting where everyone in the meeting was a person of color, and I'm like, that's never
Wow.
happened.
Mm.
And we had a really beautiful collaborative conversation, and um, I realized it was. I mean, I know this, like, okay, white supremacy is all around us. But to be in a meeting where it's so much like structure and legal things, to be able to still be collaborative, like under stress, and find the solution for the student, well, I was like, whoa, what? Like, I had to look around and take stock what was going on. And so I do think it's really important to, and myself included, to be examining our implicit bias, to which is like this idea of implicit bias is like, we don't know what we don't know. But if you're not looking at that regularly or being an active listener, that's really going to hurt the people you work with.
Mm. Speaking of implicit bias, what have you noticed about common implicit biases or stereotypes to be reflected on Indigenous people?
Oh, just lesser than, or I mean, that's a loaded question. It's different for everybody. One Native person is not the same as another. You have people who grew up in the city or grew up on the reservation. You have people who grew up on reservations with money that are federally recognized. You have people who grew up on reservations who aren't federally recognized, so they don't receive services. You have people who are estranged from their families or were taken away from their families. So that would be an individual person to person question, but the big ones are like the mascots, right? Caricatures of people are demeaning. Some of the racial slurs that are still used commonly. And those are, I mean, there's so much. A big one for me personally that happens, even with the most well-intentioned, meaning people who want to call themselves my friends, they always, it always happens, where someone will say like, "Oh, let's come back and powwow about that," and like that's really disrespectful, and really hurtful to me. That might not be to someone else though. So,
Yeah.
but I'm trying to think of, without saying the racial slurs, I'm trying to think of
Mhm.
other ones, but just this idea of like uncivilized, lesser than, like not as smart, and like not important, right? Like there's just this vibe of, I know more than you, even if you actually don't. That
Right.
would just be white supremacy, colonization, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Short, the lack of acknowledgement of colonization and the harm. Yeah.
Ooh, well, let's talk a little bit just about cultural appropriation. And I told you
Mhm.
I will let you take the complete floor on this, but I know that people do say that cultural appropriation is a myth when honestly, I mean, we know that it's not, that it affects marginalized communities, people of color every day. But I would just like to get your take on cultural appropriation and also as we're leading into Thanksgiving, education from that standpoint.
Mhm. Um, well, I'm gonna start with Thanksgiving, I think, because it relates to kind of this when so like we have been miseducated about the history of the US. There's lots of uh like glaring blind spots, right? The on Mount Rushmore where the presidents are, that used to be a really sacred site that was intentionally defaced to like put the US. That may be something you're like, "Oh, I never knew that."
I never
President
knew that.
Lincoln, yeah, President Lincoln is praised for freeing the slaves, but also he was like the biggest murderer of Native people. So
Oh wow.
there's like a lot of, like, I would say publicly, like he has the biggest public hanging of natives. But so there's these gaps in our education, intentional, right? To um to like justify, right? The justify why we're how we are, to justify colonization. I think that that's not just a US thing at all. So, in order to help students, right, with Thanksgiving or to be more aware yourself, it's about like learning the really what happened. There's many books out there. They've been around for a long time. Um, that you can go and look up and learn. And with like Google, social media, it's just the thing that you want to do is like for myself too, when I'm learning something, I'm like, who am I learning this from? Like, is this a white person retelling this story about this, or is this from the Native perspective? And we talked about before we jumped on about a movie that just came out to build awareness. But it's written by a white dude. Great film. I love him. Great director, but it's missing the Indigenous perspective. So Thanksgiving is missing the Indigenous perspective. That was actually a lot of people died that day. And it's kind of like that you can say decolonizing or unlearning. Um, but I also think it's just like going, okay, we all have implicit bias. I only know what I was exposed to and taught. And like, not everyone looks like me. So I need to start learning from other people who don't look like me, who don't have the same access as me. And then that's just going to help you across the board with all of your students who look differently than you, who, you know, when we think about speech therapy and like, oh, these standard, I mean, this is not new, right? Standardized tests, they're not done on poor Indigenous kids. So you have to look deeper. And so um, I think there's so many movements like Land Back. If you wanted to, instead of teaching about Thanksgiving, you could look up like current events. I mean, some of this stuff affects us all too. There's like the Dakota Access Pipeline. That's at the top of the Mississippi. The Mississippi watershed goes across the whole US, north to south. So if that pipeline breaks, everyone's out of clean water. And there's never been not a pipeline that doesn't break. They always break. So these issues that are like Indigenous issues are not just Indigenous issues. And so as far as Thanksgiving goes, I don't teach it. When I'm supervising people, I'm like, we're not teaching it. Um, and then I just focus on like gratitude. What are we thankful for? There's so many lessons you could easily find on Google. So instead of me saying every lesson that you should give instead, I just want to encourage you to go to Google. if I had my own lessons or a teacher pay teacher, I'd say go there, but get your lessons from Indigenous perspectives. There are Indigenous schools out there that say, hey, we recommend teaching this. And then really, if you want to be super aware, is to do it locally. What tribal lands are you occupying? Where do you live, right? And I guess if I was being really PC, I would have started off that's with that. But that would be how you could build awareness and then teach some of the history to your students. And then you're not participating in Native erasure, right? This whole thing comes back to ignoring Native perspective. So it's like you have a lot of power as a clinician, especially when you're working with young kids, to be like molding the minds of the future and building awareness for them. And I was working with someone once and they were like, we just can't like solve global warming with just like one perspective. Like we just don't know enough. So it's like our life is more beautiful when we include diversity. It's more interesting when we like can learn about each other's differences. And also we just can't survive without knowing each other and like so that, I mean, that's my long story long about Thanksgiving. um, but that ties into like Halloween and cultural appropriation. So I've never heard that cultural appropriation is a myth, to be honest. And if that is your perspective, I would just encourage you to there's an implicit bias quiz by Harvard, and Learning for Justice also has it on their website. I love their website. No affiliation. They don't know me, but I'm always talking about them. They also have the quiz there with a lot of resources, but that will help you a lot to learn about yourself and where your own biases are and start to be a safer person for your students, I guess would be the way to say that. If someone's like, well, why do I need to examine my implicit bias? It's like, well, because you're probably walking around microaggressing everyone who doesn't look like you.
Without realizing it, which is the sad part.
Right.
Yes, because you mentioned your friends who say those things, and I'm sure you've educated them. No, kind
It
of.
depends how I feel. I'm not always up for it.
Yeah, and fair, right? Like it's not necessarily our job to. We might not have the energy to because there's a
Yeah.
lot of trauma and stories behind those words and terms. You mentioned mascots, and there's one school district here. I'm in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is Indigenous land. So it's very interesting how they did finally change the mascot name. It's the same with Washington, D.C. They changed their football team's name. But there was fight about it. People did not want to change it. I'm just like, why not? And then there's another thing you mentioned, how the students who I'm supervising, again on Indigenous land, and I will be doing the same thing. Just like, y'all, please change the story. Maybe no Thanksgiving's explicit activities,
Well,
but
it's like you'll get a fail. You're not being
yeah,
culturally competent.
yeah, yeah,
Part of
yeah,
it now, so
yeah.
want to fail.
Do you take the time to educate them on those things, or what is your
I
supervision approach?
usually would be like, go find an activity and bring it back to me so we can discuss. And they
Mm,
do like it's because there's so many things out there. Um,
mhm,
it's just knowing, oh, I should go find something different because Thanksgiving is such a celebrated holiday by every store. Like stores are closed, like so it's like that's that decolonizing, that unlearning of
mm.
like I have to think outside what the norm of what I've been taught my whole life. um and then some people, I don't want to spend too much time saying people's counter arguments, but the gaps for me, like in the mascot issue, when that happened, I had all these people come to me and they're like, Nima, did you see it's gonna happen? I was like, I'll believe it when I see it. I've been
Yeah.
talking about this for over 20 years. But I went to San Diego State University, right? They have a great speech path program in Southern California. They're the Aztecs. And
Mm,
I'm gonna kind of slam them here, so that's okay if I get in
okay.
trouble. But I was on the Native American Student Alliance, and there was only 4 of us, and we would host a powwow, and we would host a high school, kind of like to expose kids, like, you could go to college here. You're a senior, junior, come to San Diego State. I think it was just a high school conference. And every year we would get blocked. They'd be like, "Oh, we gave your date to someone else. Oh, the mascot was still a white dude dressed as a native person running around." And there was only 4 of us, and we had all these barriers. Like, they wouldn't give us a telephone. But the tribes in that area are all casino tribes. And while I was there, we didn't have success, but we always tried to write in like a scholarship, right? We had to show the campus to all these students, but they couldn't like get into the school because maybe the application was online and they didn't know how to fill out the application, or they didn't have the money, or they didn't have the transportation to come from the reservation to the school.
Mm-hmm.
Yet San Diego State is getting like double-digit $1 million for this like sports team, the Aztecs. And like, how does that compute? Like, how does it compute that you have a mascot that you say, and they still have the Aztecs? So I guess we'll see if I hear from anybody. But they're a big speech path program. Like, people will know about them. But like, how do you have the Aztecs and say, "Oh, we're honoring the Aztec people"? And they're like, "Oh, because they died." They didn't die, they're alive, right? We would invite them to our powwows every year to dance. And then like no scholarship money of those $1 million was going towards the native group of the few people who got in, right? Of the 0.02 whatever I don't even think it was so small. 4, I don't know how big their campus is, but no scholarship money would ever go to any of the students. And like, I didn't receive a scholarship from them.
Wow.
And it was like a battle. And luckily I had great advisors and really like made some deep friendships. But that was like an example of native erasure, right? And to be like, we're gonna, I don't know, it's just icky on all the ends. But
yeah.
So, but that, okay, let's talk. I want to talk about your cultural appropriation comments, though. What these people.
I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
oh, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So, I'm like, how do I even mention this without even giving them the spotlight? Because they don't even deserve the spotlight. But I'll say this. So I had a cultural appropriation campaign, which actually their comments fueled my fire to bring it back. So we're going to be bringing it back in 2024. But I had to just say no. Just, remember the campaign's just say no to drugs. So just say no to cultural appropriation. And when I was doing this campaign in 2021, I shared it wasn't even a post that I created, but I shared a post that talked about, it just had little questions like, that they would have maybe in the magazines, and it'd be like yes, no questions, and it would take you on a trail, right?
Oh, I love it.
Yeah, I know. I love those too. Some people hated it in the comments, but whatever. And so a lot of people are still to this day, 2023, mind you, this is 2021, 2023, are really just being hateful and saying that cultural appropriation doesn't exist. And I mentioned to you, I read a book and some guy was invalidating cultural appropriation. In fact, he said he went up to a UCLA campus and wore
regalia.
Thank you so much. Wore regalia that reflected the Hispanic community in LA. And the students who were coming to him were actually white, and they were just like, that is absolutely wrong. And they were angry. And so his point was, they're just being performative, because when I went to that community, they were actually very supportive of it. So I don't know. That is something that I have to sit and reflect, but I'm like, but at the end of the day, there is cultural appropriation. It does exist. I've seen it happen with my own community. I've seen it happen to communities of people who I love, including you, Nima. And so, I'm gonna stand on this hill. I'm definitely gonna stand on this hill.
I love it. I'll be there with you.
Yes.
I'm there with you. Okay, so to me, cultural appropriation is taking something that doesn't belong to you and picking out what you want, right? With no regard of like acknowledging where it came from, how it impacts the environment or the people that you've taken it from. And it's like about power, right? And that's to me white supremacy. So if someone's like cultural appropriation isn't real, I'd be like, oh, white supremacy isn't real? Like, oh, like, I'm sorry, you didn't know about that? Like,
As people would argue that it's not.
but that's not the reality. I mean,
Yeah.
I feel like there's just like so much research now, right? We look at like the studies that come from hospitals about like who's dying from having babies, right? Like white supremacy is real. People who have access to resources. I don't actually argue with those people, but for the people who are like, oh my God, I don't want to culturally appropriate. You know, you're here. I see you in the comments. Um, the thing to do is to follow the money. And so if you're like, oh, I love that native blanket, it's gorgeous, but it's at Urban Outfitters. And you're like, who owns Urban Outfitters? Not a native person. So that means Urban Outfitters stole it from a native person and then reproduced it, probably with like child labor somewhere. And now you're giving your money to multiple things that you don't want to do. So follow the money. And if you're like, oh, and I feel like I have a lot of people ask me about earrings, mostly because it's part of my branding. So I'm like, let me wear, these are my new earrings from Urban Nativa. They're really beautiful. I got them.
Wait, well, let's see it. I'm gonna have you pop up. Oh, beautiful. Yeah.
But, so I think I get a lot of questions about the earrings, but don't buy your earrings from someone who's not native. Like and if you Google Indigenous artist beaded earrings, there's so many, right? And when you do that, that money is like going directly into their pocket to feed their families, you know, to feed themselves, to pay for their health bills. So that would go along with anything that you're like, well, I don't want to cultural appropriate like this shirt or, you know, I would say as far as the man wearing regalia, that's super offensive. But you might talk to someone different who isn't bothered by it.
Right.
So, and then I think a lot of the difference I see, like if we think about ideas, right? Because you can cultural appropriate ideas too. And that's where we see a lot of like social campaigns go wrong, right? Like the Me Too. I would say the Me Too campaign was culturally appropriated. Even like when we talk about intersectionality, like they rarely mention that it came from a Black professor. So it's like giving a shout out to the people that it came from. Like, hey, I was inspired. I'm interpreting this. I might have it wrong because this wasn't my idea. I think that's important to do too, especially with the social media and stuff. You know, it's like you see it all the time, people stealing each other's content. But what I think I get sad about is that it's like really like lost in translation, you know?
Yeah.
And I think recently I saw that with or I'm not even going to go there, but it's happening today, right? When we're talking about what's going on in the Middle East, I see it happening. So if you don't want to culturally appropriate, culturally appreciate, and that's something, a term you could look up, like how do I culturally appreciate? And it's really just about following the money. That's how I teach it, is that if the money and the acknowledgement and the credits are going to the Indigenous person who inspired it, then that's like the way to go. Supportive, that's being an ally.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that education. I do want to ask if really, because I'm thinking about our conversation that we had off air about educating ourselves and if there were any book recommendations or documentaries and literature that you would recommend to us.
Yeah. Can you go big again so I can see you?
I wanted to give you the spotlight.
Thank you. I'm like, I'm a little nervous. Okay, I picked out this book. This is great for middle schoolers. It's a collection of stories so they're short, so you could do them like in a lesson. This would also be good. It's really beautiful. There's poetry in here. And I like that it's celebrating different voices. And it's like there's joy and sadness and laughter in here. I mean, what was your question about books? Okay, so I
Yeah.
like this book for personal reading. It's a YA book, but you could also do it for speech lessons. And there's parts of the book that make me cry. I really like it. And then this is another book where some of the trainings I do are, most of the trainings I do are in burnout prevention.
Okay.
And these are two, it's called The Seven Circles by Chelsea Luger and Thosh Collins. They are both very popular on social media. So you could even just follow their IG to get a lot of this, but really beautiful book about living a balanced life and it includes stories and pictures. So it's the Seven Circles of Wellness, which I've really only seen one other place. It was written by a different teacher of mine, similar but different. Those are my two Indigenous books, but I got a lot more.
Yes. Well, I mean, if there's any that I mean, even if you can just DM me or,
Yeah, yeah.
and let me know.
Um, there was someone today, I was really feeling her music. She is the niece of a friend, but her name is Isabel
Okay.
on Spotify. She writes really beautiful music too, and I feel like it uh speaks to me. And it's not just like, oh, native flutes, oh, native drumming. Like it's outside of that like stereotypical. Like I feel like she's like a modern native musician. But so there's it's out there, you know. I guess I should be, if you follow me on social media, I will repost everything I love.
Yes, please. Thank you. Thank you so much. And yes, there is also Google. And I don't know how you feel about ChatGPT, but for example, I was doing a lesson on, oh, what was it? It might have been cultural appropriation, but pretty much, was it Halloween? Yes. So for the families who don't celebrate Halloween, just fall themed activities, literally just typed it into ChatGPT, come up with speech therapy ideas that have nothing to do with Halloween. Boom. It gave me like 20.
Yeah.
So yeah. So ChatGPT is actually very culturally responsive. To be
Okay. Okay.
Yes, shout out to AI. Well, before we go, Nima, I did want to get into your work with somatic healing and
Yeah.
your efforts in that. So, will you please tell us a little bit about how you came from speech pathology and into this holistic approach?
Oh yeah. So it I mean, for me it's been personal also. So it's like when I talk about native erasure like affecting me personally, it's like when I go to the doctor, I'm always kind of like gaslit, like, oh, you're making that up. Like, so I had to do it. It was also from a perspective of learning about myself and healing. Um, but I went to school and uh, was kind of like the first time on my own. And all the other times I'd worked with other SLPs close by in another building, and everyone, like we did screeners at that school and everyone qualified for speech therapy. And I was like, there's no way that all 30 kindergartners need speech therapy. And so then I started, I worked with someone there who recommended the book, The Body Keeps the Score.
Mhm.
And I think that's a good intro book, but I would just caution people, right? Like that's written by a white man who's researching white veterans coming back from war. So you have to always consider who's writing the book, who's researching, who's being researched, and like the power relationship there. Like it doesn't even include women in the book. So it's
Mm,
really like missing a lot of intersectionality. But that book, I like it. It was a good jumping off point for me because it's very scientific. He was taking brain scans and it was showed like after trauma, your frontal cortex and the left side of your brain are dark.
mm,
And it's like your amygdala and hippocampus are activated. So you're in your fight, flight, or freeze, right? We use our frontal cortex for thinking. This is our learning center, right? The receptive language. I wish I had learned it in grad school, right? That would have helped me so much with like like post-accident, like adults in rehab. Like, so to me, that's missing in our field. I do trainings on that. That's actually my new business. I was like, I need to tell you about that too. But so in this story though, that's when I really started learning about trauma. How does trauma impact our brain from the neuroscience? And really took a lot of great trainings, CEUs, right? For like people with brain damage and like how to there's so much. I'm like really being long-winded. It comes with depression and anxiety, and so I started getting into trainings of like, okay, from the neuroscience, how can we treat anxiety and depression for someone who's immobile? And I started seeing the relationship of cortisol and one of my trainings, which is a burnout prevention training and vicarious trauma, talks a lot about the brain chemicals and how we can use them to like biohack our bodies, but also help our students who are dysregulated, who are in fight or flight, who have tons of cortisol. And so the students I was working with that time were like living basically like in a war zone, constant sleeping in the bathtub, you know, things like that. And so I did all these trainings and I started implementing them into my speech lessons, and like kids started making progress. And so between like sometimes I would be like, oh, look, my alarm went off for a mindful break. But it was for me. Like I needed a mindful break, right? But the kids started joining in, and then eventually, just within a few months, I'd be walking and I'd see kids in the hall be like, hey, do you want to take a breath with me? And I was like, oh, like
thank you.
Right. And so it just became this like, well, it's good for me.
Yeah.
I was exposed to a lot of trauma myself in that setting, both to me and also through vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma is just when you hear about someone else's trauma and how it lands in your body. And also tons of microaggressions. I would say I was being microaggressed all the time and didn't know. And so I was in a state of just steady anxiety, lots of cortisol. And so I physically started to feel better too when I started making these changes. And so it was kind of like one of my pillars when I think about my life is like common humanity. It's like, it's good for me and it's good for you. And so that was really how I got into incorporating trauma. Cause that's like, if you're going to come to speech therapy, I don't want to overdiagnose people, one, right? And if you're going to come to speech therapy and not be able to learn anything I'm teaching you, like it's useless. Like the foundation, right? We always say is like build rapport, but I think it's a lot about seeing the gaps of what's going on. And it, you know, I will say too, I've supervised lots of affluent white people in speech therapy. They have anxiety too. It's just from a different pressure. And so it's like this idea of like, it's really like beneficial for everybody. And our bodies are so cool, right? We're meant to heal. So if we can take time for it, and through that also is like, I did a lot of co-teaching, which was really fun, right? I always want to stay in my lane as a speech therapist. And some of the nervous system stuff overlaps into OT with like sensory and kids with neurodiversity, and then also like the counseling and social work. So it's really like staying in your lane, but knowing you need help from these other people to really support the student or the adult or the grad student or myself. And now I do trainings on it and I love it. It's one of those things that fills my cup, and I kind of go into it like, if one person leaves this training with something they can use or for themselves, then like this was worth my time. And that's been really fun to shift away from doing things that drain me. So yeah, I'm probably going to keep doing that. But I just came up with the name. So I like actually need to ask you offline about like how to do the whole branding thing, but I'm going to do the mindful SLP, and then have like the somatic part as part of it. And then the diversity and like the equity consulting as part of it. And I love basketball, so maybe I'll have like basketball coaching. I don't know.
Oh, I like that. I like that. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, so that's exciting to have some focus. I had a business a few years ago that I left, and so I'm excited to come in with a lot more intention and not get burnt out from it.
And I'm sure that the work that you do help keeps you obviously from getting burnt out, because now you have the tools now
Yeah, yeah.
that helped, catalyze this.
And acupuncture. I love acupuncture.
Ooh, have you heard of EFT tapping? How it touches on the so yeah, we'll talk offline about,
Yeah,
about that.
yeah.
I'll keep you here all day. Well, Nima, where can people find you if they want to know more about your work, especially with this new business?
Yeah. So right now I would say the um somatic healing solution on Instagram or LinkedIn. I haven't been very active on either one because I've been over here simmering, figuring out what's next. But I can post all of my upcoming trainings. I have a few actually the week of Thanksgiving because I don't celebrate Thanksgiving. So I'll post those there. They're free. I try to do free training. So they're through Fred Finch. And then I'm gonna part of this. I'll put it all on somatic healing solution, but there'll be some video trainings available, and I'm always available one-on-one, especially if grad students are like trying to apply or are in the program and have difficulty if they're experiencing microaggressions at their program. I always set aside 4 hours a month, so feel free to always reach out and we can meet. It's just a part of my schedule to. I want to keep our SLPs of color feeling good.
Thank you for all of the work that you are doing, Nima. I would love to have you back on here just to talk about these healing practices. But yes, so everyone, thank you so much for coming up live, everyone watching the replay. I hope that you learned something from Nima today, and really that we can build a more culturally responsive field and cut out these microaggressions and the pain that comes from it. Until then, bye.